Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. And thanks, folks, for joining me this morning. So today I'm going to give a brief overview of the climate research that the NOAA Northeast Fisheries Science Center has been conducting over the last 5 or 6 years or so. Oops. So the outline of my talk today, the first component, I'm going to talk about observed change in the U.S. Northeast Shelf. Most of the slides I show today will come from our what we call our State of the Ecosystem report, which is available online, and we update this report every year. And then I'm going to get into the National Climate Science Strategy, which was published about 5 or 6 years ago, and then into our Northeast Regional Action Plan as it relates to climate science in the U.S. Northeast region. And then I want to talk about our recent accomplishments, at least over the last 5 years, with regard to our regional action plan. So I'll be talking about climate vulnerability assessment, scenario planning, some of our laboratory studies in our labs in New Jersey and Connecticut, getting climate information into fishery stock assessments, some of the changes we've been observing in terms of species distributions from our surveys, our bottom trawl surveys in particular, and then also talk about projections. And then I'll wrap up with a discussion in terms of what I think is needed to achieve climate-ready fisheries management, which will then get into our most recent NOAA Climate and Fisheries Initiative. So just to give folks a brief overview of the oceanography of the U.S. Northeast, essentially what we call the U.S. Northeast at NOAA stretches from the Gulf of Maine, encompassing part of the Western Scotian Shelf in Canada, down to Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. Out to the shelf break, doesn't really include much deeper waters past the shelf break, but essentially south of New England, we identify that region between Hatteras and Long Island as the Mid-Atlantic Bight. And then, of course, we have Georges Bank, Nantucket Shoals, and the Gulf of Maine. The unique feature about this region is that it sits in between two major current systems. So you can see the Gulf Stream current, the warmer, saltier current coming from the south, from the tropics, and then the Labrador current deriving from the north, which is the colder, fresher current. So the Northeast Shelf essentially sits at the interface of these two currents. And the major throughway by which these currents enter the US Northeast Shelf is via this channel here in the Gulf of Maine. I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but you can see these arrows pointing in and then coming out of the Gulf of Maine. This is called the Northeast Channel. And these two current systems enter the Gulf of Maine at depth through this channel at about 150 to 200 meters, in which we call slope water. So they're not actually entering through surface waters, they're coming in through the slope water. So there's this slope sea along the shelf break, which is a mix of Labrador and Gulf Stream water. And most interestingly, over the last 10 years or so, the majority of the source water entering the Gulf of Maine has been primarily derived from the Gulf Stream. So Gulf Stream, warmer, saltier slope water. There's also these warm core rings, which can also, it's another mechanism by which Gulf Stream water can enter the shelf. These warm core mesoscale eddies can enter the shelf from the surface down to 50, 60 meters, sometimes even greater depths, and actually hang out in regions like the shelf break for long periods of time. And they can manifest themselves as marine heat waves. And we can see that in our surface satellite records. So in terms of observed change in the region, this is a figure directly from the State of the Ecosystem report that I mentioned earlier. This is from our report that was published this year. It's our 2020 report, so it includes data up through 2020. And these reports are typically published around the early spring of each year. So our 2021 report or our 2022 report should come out around March or April of 2022, which will have conditions up through 2021. And so what this figure shows is sea surface temperature measured by satellites. And in the red, these are the SST trends for Georges Bank, and the black is showing the Gulf of Maine for the winter, spring, summer, and fall. And what you can see is that throughout the spring, summer, and fall, there's been an increasing trend, a warming trend in sea surface temperature. Although if you look at the magnitude of the slope of those trends, they're not always the same. So for example, we've seen somewhat of a greater warming in the Gulf of Maine at about 0.8 degrees per decade, whereas in the summertime for Georges Bank, we've observed about a half degree, excuse me, per decade change in sea surface temperature. The interesting thing here is if you look at the wintertime observations, we haven't observed a significant warming in wintertime surface temperatures. This is something that we've observed even going further back from 1980, so going back to the 1960s and 70s. And so most of the warming that we've observed in the Northeast Shelf has been primarily in the summer and fall. So for this talk, I'll be mostly talking about Georges Bank and the Gulf of Maine, given that I'll be mostly engaged with the New England audience. We do also report on the Mid-Atlantic Bight, south of Long Island down to the Hatteras. So our SOE reports are divided between the Mid-Atlantic and the Gulf of Maine and Georges Bank. So I'll mostly be talking about the New England component of that report today, and some of the other stuff I'll be talking about. So in terms of marine heat waves, this is another way that we can measure ocean warming. And there's two ways we report on marine heat waves. So the marine heat waves are an index of ocean warming based on sea surface temperature, daily sea surface temperature measurements from satellites. And so on the top, I'm showing Georges Bank in terms of cumulative intensity of marine heat waves on the left, and then maximum intensity. The difference between the two is that cumulative intensity gives you a sense of the frequency of marine heat waves and also how warm they are. Maximum intensity just gives you a sense of how warm the marine heat waves are with no temporal component. But the take-home message here is that in both Georges Bank and the Gulf of Maine, we've seen an increase in both the frequency of marine heat waves and also the magnitude or the maximum intensity of marine heat waves. We also look at things like the Gulf Stream. So these larger scale teleconnections to regional oceanographic dynamics in the Northeast Shelf. The Gulf Stream is one of those common indices that we look at in terms of trends. And what we've observed since over the last 10 years or so is that the Gulf Stream has been gradually shifting north. And so if you look at this figure here, you can see that since about 2010, the northern wall of the Gulf Stream has been pushing further north each year. And if you remember what I mentioned earlier, the measurements that our NOAA surveys conduct in the Northeast Channel in the Gulf of Maine suggest that the majority of water, slope water entering the Gulf of Maine is in fact deriving from the Gulf Stream, which would corroborate with a time series like this showing a more northern position of that current system. So this is the slope water proportions measured in Northeast Channel from our NOAA ECOMON and bottom trawl surveys. And so the red line essentially is an indicator of Gulf Stream slope water. So that's your warmer, saltier slope water that enters the Gulf of Maine at depth. And the lighter colored blue line is slope water associated with the Labrador Current. So the colder, fresher slope water that enters the Gulf of Maine. And what you can see is that much like the Gulf Stream, since about 2010, over the last 10 years, the majority of the water entering the Gulf of Maine is deriving from the Gulf Stream. So it's the predominant source water from the slope sea entering the Gulf of Maine, which is that warmer, saltier source. So we also conduct measurements of ocean acidification. Unfortunately, most of those measurements have been at the surface. So what this figure shows is the change in surface ocean pH from 1980 to 2009. And you can see there's been a general or gradual decrease in pH, which indicates a higher rate of acidification. So as carbon dioxide is being absorbed by the ocean, that water becomes more acidic. And so this change in ocean pH that we've observed since the early 80s is consistent with global measurements that also show a similar change of about almost about 0.1 or so in terms of a decrease in ocean pH. So we are starting to look at ocean glider measurements, particularly coming from Rutgers University, which are measuring changes in ocean pH at depth. And of course, one of the main reasons why we care about pH is not just for shellfish like lobster and scallops, which are some of the most, if not the most valuable commercial species in the nation, but also for larval fish, larval fin fish. Some of our studies have shown significant impacts of changing ocean acidification on the survivorship of larval fish. In mostly the case, we've looked at flatfish. So we can also look at the impact of warming on our surveys in terms of what we're seeing in species distribution. So this is a figure from the Rutgers Ocean Adaptive website, which gives you a sense of the change in latitude, or the mean change in latitude, among all the marine taxa that we sample in our fall bottom trawl survey. We also run a spring bottom trawl survey, but the majority of the shifts that we observed had occurred in the fall, which makes sense given that most of the warming has occurred in the summer and fall. So this essentially shows that the majority of marine taxa throughout the Mid-Atlantic and New England waters have been moving to the north. Again, this is an average, so some species haven't shifted, but the majority have shifted to the north. If you look at changes in depth from that same survey source, there's also been a deepening of where species are being caught. So a gradual deepening of depth in terms of the average depth where all these marine taxa are being caught in our bottom trawl. So about 5 or 6 years ago, NOAA published the NOAA Fisheries Climate Science Strategy. And essentially the strategy is part of a proactive approach to increase production, delivery, and use of climate-related information to fulfill NOAA mandates. There's no doubt that the ocean is changing. However, the current fisheries management strategies and legislation aren't geared toward dealing with these rapid effects that we're seeing, or these rapid changes that we're seeing in some key commercial and recreational species. And this includes protected species as well, animals like right whales, protected species like Atlantic salmon, river herring, so on and so forth. This is not just focused on commercial and rec species. So the science strategy was divided into 7 major objectives, and these are all interdependent. They range from essentially building and maintaining adequate science infrastructure, which deals with just maintaining our surveys so we can actually track and provide early warnings when we see changes. This includes both our physical and biological measurements. Also understanding mechanisms of change. So, using our laboratory facilities to conduct experiments, like I mentioned earlier, for example, changes in ocean acidification on larval finfish, and things like that. Projecting future conditions, so using climate models to project long-term and also near-term changes in ocean ecosystem conditions. And then, of course, on the management side, adaptive management processes, robust management strategies, and then climate-informed reference points. And again, these are all interdependent objectives, and this is in these objectives were written on a national level. And so the climate science strategy tasked each region, including the Northeast, which developing their own regional action plan under the National Climate Science Strategy. So in the Northeast, we have what's called the Northeast Regional Action Plan, or what we call the NERAP. So this was published back in 2016, and we most recently revised the NERAP, which we're calling the NERAP 2.0. And this document is currently under public review. But essentially, this document, the way we first wrote the report, or the action plan, was to get a gauge for how we're conducting our climate science research with our existing funding resources, and then what we could do if we have new funding resources. The NERAP 2.0 is written a bit differently. Once that report is complete, I'd be happy to share it with this group here. But the NERAP 1.0 and the national strategy are available to the public. And those can be found on our NOAA climate websites. So we've also conducted vulnerability analyses, or vulnerability assessments. So the first vulnerability assessment that was published was by John Herridall in 2016. This is a paper that was published in PLOS One. And over 80 invertebrate and vertebrate commercial and rec and protected species were analyzed in this assessment. And essentially, the assessment involved a bunch of experts among different species. And then risk scores were assigned to various species based on their known sensitivity to ocean warming, sea level rise, acidification. There might have been some other factors there, but it was mostly ocean warming and ocean acidification. And so this particular figure from Herridall is specific to the New England region. And so those species in the middle that are considered a neutral effect are species that have a minimal or no or a low to moderate risk in terms of climate change impacts. You can see no species were listed as having a positive impact. And then those listed in red are those species that were assigned high risk to climate change. The species names that are in bold, or the common names there, just essentially indicate lower uncertainty. And so those common names that are in white have a higher uncertainty. But you can see a lot of common New England species there that were assigned high risk to climate change. We've also conducted social vulnerability studies. So this is a paper by Lisa Colburn et al. That was published in 2016. And essentially what they did here was look at the various ports along the US Northeast and assigned a vulnerability score. And that vulnerability score was based on both the value, the total value at those ports, but also the diversity. So essentially what they found in a nutshell was that those ports that have a higher diversity of catch also had a lower to moderate vulnerability score. So those ports that were bringing in a less diverse catch had a higher vulnerability. So essentially suggesting that those ports that have more diverse catch could have a higher adaptability to future changes because they're already having a more diverse catch or more diverse landings. We've also conducted scenario planning. So this is a bit different than the vulnerability assessment that I showed earlier by Harrod et al. This is more looking at long-term future scenarios. In this case, we looked at Atlantic salmon and North Atlantic right whales, two protected species, and looked at different scenarios in the future. So changes in the climate, changes in management, changes in ship lane traffic, for example, which is a major factor in North Atlantic right whales. And then we could essentially look at different outcomes that contribute to data modeling. We look at management strategy evaluations, and both of these reports have been peer reviewed and they're published. And so we're looking to conduct more of these long-term scenario planning exercises. Scenario planning is something that isn't specific to the sciences. It's also done in other fields as well. And there's currently a US East Coast scenario planning, climate scenario planning exercise that's being led by NIMS and the Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council. And that's an East Coast wide scenario planning exercise, which is currently underway. So if you go to the Mid-Atlantic Management Council's website, you can get more information on the US East Coast scenario planning effort that is currently underway. So we've also done some work in terms of incorporating climate change or climate or environmental variables into stock assessments. Most of the work has focused on yellowtail, southern New England yellowtail flounder. A lot of the work by Tim Miller and others using the Woods Hole assessment model. We've also done some recent work looking at the cold pool from both observations and ocean models in its effect on southern New England yellowtail recruitment. That's a current paper that we have in review. There's also been some work looking at winter flounder, and this is a paper by Rich Bell et al., and also some work on Atlantic cod. So in order to understand the long-term or even near-term impacts of climate change, we have to rely on global climate models. And so there are different ways that we call downscale these global models for regional analyses like the Northeast. So the US North region is relatively small compared to not just the global ocean, but also the entire Atlantic basin. So we found over the last 5 years or so that we really need these higher resolution ocean models that are fully coupled to climate models to get a sense of projected change, long-term decadal projected change along the US East Coast. So what this animation shows is a high resolution ocean model running at 10 kilometers horizontal resolution. So this could be your 4K ultra high definition television. And on the right-hand side, this is a standard 100 kilometer ocean model. And this is running sea surface temperature, daily sea surface temperature. And what you can see is that when you increase the resolution of the ocean, the Gulf Stream is resolved much more accurately compared to how the Gulf Stream is resolved in a coarser model. You can see the Gulf Stream essentially overshoots Cape Hatteras, runs into the Mid-Atlantic Bight, almost to Long Island. But the Gulf Stream on the left panel, the left animation, you can see it is breaking off Hatteras about where it should. You can see lots of mesoscale eddies and meandering coming off the current. And some instability further into the Northeast. And we just don't get those features. And obviously, the Labrador current is also better resolved in the higher resolution model. So over the last 5 or 6 years or so, we've been using these higher resolution models to project long-term climate change in the US Northeast. So what do those projections look like? So this figure here is from a paper that we published about 5 years ago, looking at changes in ocean conditions, primarily temperature and salinity. In this case, we're looking at bottom ocean temperature change under a doubling of atmospheric CO2. So this is what's called an idealized scenario, where atmospheric CO2 increases by 1% per year until it doubles in the climate model by year 70. And what you can see is at the bottom right corner, which is the higher resolution model, which we call GFDL CM 2.6, projects an enhanced warming throughout the US Northeast, particularly around the shelf break, which are these areas in red here, and also in the Northeast Channel, as I mentioned earlier, where that Gulf Stream and Labrador slope water enter the US Northeast shelf. And so this is consistent with our NOAA measurements that we're looking at today, where we're showing a higher proportion of Gulf Stream water entering the Northeast Channel. So the reason in the model why we're getting these enhanced warming areas along the Northeast that we don't see in the coarser models is because we need that higher resolution to not only get the bathymetry right, features like George's Bank, which also govern circulation, but also the current systems. And that regional circulation combined with global warming is the reason why we're getting an enhanced warming along the US Northeast in the model, which appears to be consistent with observations today, showing a more northern Gulf Stream and more of that Gulf Stream water entering at depth into the Gulf of Maine. So we've been using this model pretty consistently over the last 5 years for a lot of our work. There's been some more recent work with regional downscaling, what we call dynamical downscaling, where regional high resolution models, in this case, it's called a model called ROMS. This model is embedded into a coarser global climate model. And when they conducted this study, this was published about 2 years ago in 2019, they found that in some cases, the Gulf Stream does shift further north under a high emission scenario, but not to the extent that was found in the global high resolution model, which is the model that we've mostly been focused on at the Northeast Fisheries Science Center. It's unclear as to why there are differences in these two, but it does appear that the global high-res model is consistent with our observations over the last 10 years or so, which gives us more confidence in those projections. But we will need about 10, 20 more years worth of data and observations to confirm how well those projections or what the actual uncertainty is in those projections. So we've taken these high resolution projections and we've applied them to species distribution models. So typically what we do is we use our bottom trawl surveys to build GAMs, and these GAMs, and we don't just use GAMs to build these species distribution models, we use other habitat models as well, but we're using them essentially as presence absence. We're not modeling abundance, which is obviously much harder to do. We're simply measuring changes in species distribution using our observations over the last 3 or 4 decades and then projecting forward. So this is a case for, for winter flounder. We published this back in 2019, and essentially what we did was we projected changes in winter flounder habitat using just temperature, which is denoted as the partial model, the temperature only model, and then we projected winter flounder habitat change using multiple variables. So variables such as rugosity, bottom temperature, surface temperature, depth, sea surface height, bottom salinity, and surface salinity. Interestingly enough, we found that the strongest predictor variable of winter flounder habitat was bottom salinity. Not exactly sure why that occurred. It could be because these animals spawn in brackish estuary water. But the interesting thing is that when you only look at temperature, you get a much different picture, a much different projection for changes in winter flounder habitat compared to the full model. So essentially, we're suggesting much less habitat availability using the full model, using all variables compared to the temperature only model. So over the last 5 or 6 years or so, if we kind of look at all of our Northeast Fisheries Science Center publications in the climate research realm, most of the work has focused on looking at observed trends, which comes under the maintaining infrastructure objective and tracking change of the national strategy, and also understanding mechanisms and projecting future conditions, like the example I just showed in the previous slide. Where we've been lacking is the informing management side. I think one of the reasons is because this is just much more difficult to do. When we project, say, for example, 50 to 60-year changes, projected changes in winter flounder habitat, that doesn't do a whole lot for informing tactical year-to-year fisheries management decisions. And so if we kind of look at that on a scale of both the temporal scale shown on the x-axis and a spatial scale on the y-axis in terms of the dynamics of weather through climate, and then fishery industry operations all the way through rebuilding plans, resilience, and sustainability, we kind of see where the current realm that we're working in, which is most of this decadal area, where we're looking at 50 to 60 to 100-year long-term projections of species change in the U.S. Northeast, which is mostly relevant to scenario planning and also fishery rebuilding plans and protected areas. However, where we need to focus more of our research are these annual, seasonal, and semi-decadal timescales. The problem, though, is that the models, the current suite of ocean and climate models, have very poor skill in terms of their predictability in year-to-year changes in ocean temperature. So what's needed to achieve climate-ready fisheries and protected species management? So number one, we need more studies that identify the mechanistic underpinnings or mechanistic relationship between stock assessment variables such as recruitment, natural mortality growth, and environmental variables, temperature, ocean circulation, ocean pH, prime production, things like that, predation. And we also need more skillful ocean forecasts. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the majority of the work that we've done has dealt with these longer term decadal projections because we just don't have skillful seasonal to annual forecasts that might actually benefit tactical fishery management decisions as opposed to these longer decadal projections that we've mostly been focused on. We also need a more unified NOAA ocean modeling system. As I mentioned earlier, you can see the value of high resolution models, but they come at a cost. They're very expensive to run. They require a lot more computer processing time and resources. And there's just not many of these high resolution climate models around the world. So we're trying to fix that with the NOAA ClimateFishers Initiative, which I'll get into in my next few slides. We also need to establish communities of practice to use these different tools, and also cross NOAA regional teams to support the production and application of these new high resolution ocean models, these forecast projections and hindcasts. So about 2 years ago, we started working on what we're calling the NOAA ClimateFishers Initiative. And it's currently a white paper, and it's in the president's proposed budget for FY22, but it's still unknown if it will actually be fully funded by Congress. But if it is, this will actually fund that infrastructure that I was talking about in the previous slide, where we can actually, NOAA can start to design these regional high resolution historical, forecasted, and long-term projected runs throughout the different regions in the nation. So for example, a larger US East Coast run at a very high resolution running in hindcast mode, forecast mode, and projection mode, which could benefit protected species, commercial species, and recreational species management, potentially on a year-to-year basis. But essentially, the four major action items are to enhance the utility of existing climate information, advance the regional modeling system within NOAA, and also establish these regional teams and communities of practice, which would be folks that are within and outside of NOAA, folks like yourselves who are working for state organizations, state agencies, to help with the implementation and also the use of these new tools and high resolution products that can be used for living marine resource management. So essentially the way the Fisheries Initiative, the ClimateFishers Initiative works is you can kind of see it through this circle diagram here, where these ocean models are built within NOAA. It's a collaboration of both the Fisheries Service, the Ocean Service, Ocean Atmospheric Research, and also the National Weather Service. So the Weather Service has a lot of atmospheric forecasting models that can be applied to our ocean forecasting models. And then essentially we would have an Arctic, an East Coast, Pacific Islands, and a West Coast regional runs. And these models would then be useful for, so the East Coast run in our case would be used by the Northeast Fisheries Science Center, Southeast Fisheries Science Center, and also folks working in the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. And essentially we would have interaction between the US Northeast, Southeast, and regional teams feeding back to the NOAA ocean modelers who are actually working out the nuts and bolts of these models getting feedback from the fisheries scientists and other oceanographers in terms of what's needed, where are the models working, where are they not working, how can we better validate these models to produce more skillful forecasts, historical ones and long-term projections, which can be useful for living marine resource management. So it's a constant feedback system between application and ocean model and climate model development. So the goal for this ClimateFishers Initiative is that in 2 years, we'll have these communities of practice established. These communities will be linking resource managers, researchers, weather forecasters to ensure that we have the best available information for living marine resource management. These new regional runs, which we call the ocean model that we're currently using, is called MOM6. It's NOAA's state-of-the-art ocean model, which was submitted to the most recent IPCC assessment report. And this model is currently being pilot studied for an East Coast run running at about a 7-kilometer resolution. But the goal is to produce historical hindcast predictions and projections and to assess and validate that model using observations. We've also launched new research and modeling efforts to improve the understanding of climate impacts on biological resources and best management strategies for reducing risk and increasing resilience. NOAA is also leveraging past and future investments to make this data information more available for use. And so in 5 years, the idea would to have these regional MOM6 or these regional high resolution ocean simulations operational. So essentially we're giving fisheries management councils, in our case, the New England and the Mid-Atlantic councils, annual updates in terms of historical runs and also ocean forecasts, where we can provide, for example, seasonal sea surface temperature, bottom temperature predictions that could potentially benefit a fisheries management decision, either qualitatively or quantitatively. The goal would be to have some of these indices quantitatively in a stock assessment, which we're starting to look at now in some of the species where we've identified these mechanistic relationships. But currently, most stock assessments throughout the US are not incorporating even observed environmental information, let alone forecasted. So there's still a lot of work to be done just to get these observed environmental indices into an assessment. But this is going to require cross-NOAA regional teams to support these types of exercises. And it's going to require more NOAA investments. So this is going to be obviously a funding issue that's going to require hiring new staff and basically building and maintaining this new CFI infrastructure. But ultimately, the goal is to have this climate-ready information available for the actual decision makers who are getting together every year to make these decisions. So this animation here is to give you an example of what that high-resolution regional MOM6 run would look like. And so this is surface chlorophyll being run at a 7-kilometer resolution for the US East Coast domain, which currently goes from the Gulf of Mexico up through the southern portion of the Grand Banks. And what you can see is running at a high resolution, this includes nutrient inputs from freshwater and estuarine sources as well, is that you can really get a lot of detail from these high resolution runs. So, one major outcome of this work is that we're not only going to be looking at physics, but we're also going to be looking at biogeochemistry. So for researchers and folks that are interested in variables like phytoplankton production, zooplankton production, dissolved oxygen, chlorophyll, ocean pH, those variables can be simulated in these biogeochemical runs, historically forecasted and also in a long-term projection. So just to wrap up here, this is an example of something that we're calling the Northeast Climate Integrated Modeling Project, or we're also calling it Incline. This is a collaborative project between NOAA, the Gulf of Maine Research Institute, and Rutgers University. And essentially, one of the main goals within this project is to basically target those stocks that are up for research track assessments. So within the US Northeast, when a stock is up for what we call a research track assessment, that is the time when the assessment model can be reevaluated, reassessed, and changes can be made. And so for this particular exercise, Atlantic cod, yellowtail flounder, and black sea bass were 3 species that have upcoming research track assessments. And the goal is to look at climate ocean models in terms of their historical simulations and forecast products, and also long-term projections, and how we can get that information into ecosystem and population models, but also consider human dimension models as well. So the social sciences side of things, and how we can better inform that research track assessment, which essentially is informing the management process. So this would give us a more direct avenue to stakeholder engagement, and potentially these tactical decision-making opportunities would hopefully best be served if we can actually provide this information in a beneficial way, whether it's quantitative or qualitative. Any way we can we're just looking for more on-ramps where we can inform an assessment with climate information. And then my last slide, I just wanted to update folks here that we are running a U.S. Northeast Climate Fisheries seminar series. It started back in January of this year. We have one presentation per month. For any folks interested, or I'll pass on the link to Gary to share with the group. But each month we have a different talk related to climate, fisheries, and protected species research in the U.S. Northeast. So you can see our list of talks for 2021, and we hope to have another set of talks for 2022. So for any folks in the audience today that's interested in giving one of these presentations, please let me know, and I'd be happy to put you on the calendar. And I'll stop there for any questions.